They had nowhere to run, and we had every direction covered. From my position behind a fallen teak tree, I could see the panic in their eyes as the realization hit them. Nearly 100,000 Japanese troops, once the masters of Southeast Asia, now trapped like animals in the thick jungle of central Burma. The monsoon rains had turned the earth to mud, and the smell of death hung heavy in the humid air. My name is Staff Sergeant Tommy Chen, second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco's Chinatown, and I was part of the most unlikely fighting force in the Pacific Theater, Merrill's Marauders. This was May 1945, and we were about to witness the complete destruction of the Japanese Burma Area Army. The morning mist clung to the jungle canopy above us as I adjusted my grip on my M1 Garand. My unit, the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, better known as Merrill's Marauders, had been fighting in this green hell for over a year. We were volunteers, every last one of us, drawn from units across the Pacific. Most of the guys were regular American GIs, but there were about 24 of us Chinese Americans who'd been specifically recruited for this mission. Our faces could blend in with the local population, and many of us spoke Mandarin or Cantonese, which proved invaluable when working with Chinese forces. "Chen, you see movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Corporal Murphy, a redhead from Boston who'd become my closest friend in this nightmare. His freckled face was streaked with mud and sweat, and his green fatigues were torn from weeks of jungle fighting. I squinted through the dense undergrowth. About 50 yards away, I could make out the distinctive rising sun patches on Japanese uniforms. They were moving in single file, completely unaware that 3 regiments of Marauders had them surrounded. Behind us, I knew that British forces under Lord Mountbatten were advancing from the west, while Chinese divisions commanded by General Stilwell pressed from the north. The Japanese 28th Army, under General Sakurai, had walked straight into the largest trap of the Burma campaign. "I count at least 40 of them," I whispered back to Murphy, "and they're heading straight for Lieutenant Morrison's position." The lieutenant was positioned about 100 yards to our left with 2 squads of Marauders. Behind him, hidden in the thick bamboo, were elements of the Chinese 38th Division. These Chinese soldiers had been fighting the Japanese since 1937, long before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war. They'd lost their homeland, seen their families scattered or killed, and now they fought with a cold determination that sometimes unsettled even us hardened Americans. I thought about my own family back in San Francisco. My father had immigrated from Guangdong Province in 1920, opening a small restaurant in Chinatown. When I'd volunteered for this mission, he gripped my shoulders with tears in his eyes. "You fight for both countries now," he'd said in broken English. "You make both proud." Now, crouched in this Burma jungle, I understood what he meant. I was fighting for America, the country that had given my family opportunity, but I was also fighting alongside Chinese soldiers to liberate their homeland. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. The Japanese patrol was getting closer, their voices barely audible over the constant buzz of insects and the distant rumble of artillery. General Merrill's plan was working perfectly. For months, we'd been conducting hit-and-run attacks, appearing and disappearing like ghosts in the jungle. The Japanese had no idea how many of us there were or where we'd strike next. Now, in May 1945, with Japan's position in Southeast Asia crumbling, they were attempting a massive retreat toward Thailand. They'd never make it. The trap had been months in the making. I remembered the briefing back in March when General Frank Merrill himself had outlined the plan. The man was a legend, tough as nails, spoke fluent Japanese, and had been fighting in the Pacific since the beginning. He stood before our assembled unit in a clearing outside Maikina, his weathered face serious as death. "Gentlemen, the Japanese are finished in Burma," he'd announced, pointing to a large map. "Intelligence indicates that General Sakurai is preparing to evacuate nearly 100,000 troops from central Burma back to Thailand. Our job is to make sure they never get there." The plan was audacious in its scope. Allied forces would create a massive encirclement, with Marauders and Chinese units cutting off retreat routes while British forces applied pressure from the rear. It would be the largest coordinated offensive in the Burma campaign, designed to trap and destroy the entire Japanese Burma Area Army. Now, 2 months later, I could see that plan coming to fruition. The Japanese patrol was almost on top of Lieutenant Morrison's position. I could make out individual faces now, young soldiers, probably no older than myself, but worn down by months of fighting and retreat. Their uniforms were faded and patched, their equipment showing signs of hard use. These weren't the confident, well-equipped troops that had conquered Southeast Asia in 1942. These were the remnants of a broken army. "Wait for the signal," I whispered to Murphy and the rest of my squad. We had learned patience in this jungle. The Marauders specialized in ambush tactics, and timing was everything. Strike too early, and the enemy might escape. Strike too late, and they might discover your position. Through the undergrowth, I saw Lieutenant Morrison raise his hand. The signal. Instantly, the jungle erupted in gunfire. The distinctive crack of M1 Garands mixed with the deeper boom of Chinese bolt-action rifles and the chatter of Japanese Nambu machine guns. The patrol we'd been watching scattered, but they had nowhere to go. Every escape route was covered by Allied forces. "Now," shouted Morrison, and we rose from our concealment. The 40-man Japanese patrol found themselves caught in a crossfire from 3 directions. I aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger of my Garand, feeling the familiar kick against my shoulder. A Japanese soldier spun and fell. Murphy was firing rapidly to my right, his shots finding their mark with practiced precision. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 38 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the mud. 2 had managed to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. As we moved forward to secure the area, I could see the terror in their eyes. They knew what was happening. They knew their army was trapped. "Good work, Sergeant Chen," said Lieutenant Morrison as he approached our position. Morrison was a West Point graduate from Virginia, probably 5 years younger than my 24 years, but he'd proven himself in countless engagements. "How many did we get?" 38 Kia, 2 prisoners, I reported. "No casualties on our side." Morrison nodded grimly. "That's the 3rd patrol we've intercepted today. Intelligence was right. They're trying to break out toward the south, but we've got every route covered." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of heavy fighting erupted from the south, the direction the Japanese had been heading. Chinese artillery was pounding suspected Japanese positions, while British Bren guns chattered in the distance. The trap was closing from all sides. One of the Japanese prisoners, a young private who couldn't have been more than 19, was staring at me with obvious confusion. He'd probably never seen a Chinese face in American uniform before. I addressed him in Mandarin, asking for information about his unit strength and positions. His eyes widened in surprise, but he remained silent. "The Chinese units are reporting heavy contact all along the southern perimeter," Morrison continued, consulting his radio. "Looks like Sakurai is throwing everything he has at our lines, trying to punch through. I thought about the Chinese soldiers fighting alongside us. Many of them were from the same provinces that the Japanese had occupied since 1937. They'd seen their villages burned, their families scattered or killed. For them, this wasn't just another military operation. It was personal revenge. And they fought with a ferocity that reflected that personal stake in the outcome. "Sir, what are our orders?" asked Murphy, reloading his rifle. Morrison studied his map for a moment. "We move south and reinforce the Chinese 22nd Division. Intelligence indicates that's where Sakurai is concentrating his breakout attempt. If we can hold that line, we'll have them completely surrounded." As we prepared to move out, I took one last look at the battlefield. 38 more Japanese soldiers who would never see their homeland again. Multiply that by hundreds of similar engagements happening all across central Burma, and you began to understand the scale of the disaster befalling the Japanese Burma Area Army. This wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was the complete annihilation of Japanese power in Southeast Asia. The forced march south took us through some of the worst terrain he'd ever encountered. The monsoon rains had turned every stream into a raging torrent, and the jungle floor was a slippery mess of mud and rotting vegetation. We moved in single file, Marauders and Chinese soldiers mixed together. Our different uniforms and equipment, the only thing distinguishing us in the green twilight of the jungle canopy. Sergeant Liu Wei-Ming of the Chinese 22nd Division had joined our column as a liaison. Liu was a veteran of 8 years of fighting against the Japanese. and his weathered face told the story of countless battles. He spoke excellent English, having studied at a missionary school in Shanghai before the war. The Japanese are desperate now, Liu told me as we slogged through a particularly muddy section of trail. Our radio intercepts indicate they know they're surrounded. General Sakurai has ordered a final breakout attempt, everything they have, concentrated on a 2-mile front. I wiped sweat from my forehead, leaving a streak in the mud caked on my face. How many are we talking about? Perhaps 15,000 troops in the main assault, Liu replied. But they have to break through 3 Chinese divisions plus your Marauders. And behind them, the British are closing in from the north. The numbers were staggering. In all my time in the Pacific, I'd never been part of an operation of this scale. Most of our previous engagements had involved companies or battalions. This was an entire army being systematically destroyed. We reached the Chinese positions just as the sun was setting. The 22nd Division had dug in along a ridge that commanded the main trail south, the only route the Japanese could use to move their heavy equipment. Chinese soldiers had worked for days preparing their positions, digging interconnected trenches and sighting their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire. Americans. "Thank God you're here," called out Colonel Wang, the Chinese regimental commander. His English was heavily accented but clear. Wang was probably in his 40s, a career soldier who'd been fighting since the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. His uniform was clean and well-maintained, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Lieutenant Morrison conferred with Colonel Wang while the rest of us took positions along the ridge. I found myself in a foxhole between Murphy and a Chinese soldier named Private Chen, no relation despite the shared surname. Private Chen was probably 18 years old, with the serious expression of someone who'd seen too much death for his age. "You speak Chinese?" he asked in Mandarin, obviously surprised to hear his language from an American uniform. "My parents are from Guangdong," I replied in the same language. "We came to America when I was young." Private Chen nodded thoughtfully. "My village was near Nanjing. The Japanese killed my family in 1937. My sister, my parents, my grandparents." His voice was matter of fact, but I could see the pain in his eyes. "I have been fighting them ever since." Stories like Private Chen's were common among the Chinese soldiers. The Japanese occupation of China had been marked by horrific brutality, the of Nanjing, the use of biological weapons, the systematic murder of civilians. For these Chinese troops, the war wasn't about territory or politics. It was about survival and revenge. "Contact front," shouted a lookout from further down the line. Through the gathering darkness, we could see movement in the valley below. The Japanese breakout attempt was beginning. At first, it was just shadows moving between the trees. Then the sound reached us, the trudge of boots through mud, the clink of equipment, voices speaking in urgent Japanese. They were coming in force, just as intelligence had predicted. "Hold your fire until they're in the kill zone," called Colonel Wang. "Let them get close." The tension was almost unbearable. I could feel my heart pounding as I gripped my rifle, waiting for the order to fire. Beside me, Private Chen was absolutely still, his rifle aimed steadily at the trail below. Murphy was muttering something under his breath, probably a prayer. The first Japanese soldiers appeared on the trail about 200 yards below our position. They were moving cautiously, clearly aware they were walking into potential danger. Behind them, I could see more troops emerging from the jungle, hundreds of them, carrying everything from rifles to light artillery pieces. 15,000 troops, I whispered to myself. If Liu's intelligence was correct, we were about to engage an enemy force roughly 3 times our size. But we held the high ground, we had prepared positions, and we had the element of surprise. The Japanese column stretched back into the jungle as far as I could see. Soldiers, pack animals, even some trucks and artillery pieces. This wasn't just a military retreat. It was the evacuation of an entire army. Equipment that had taken years to transport to Burma was now being abandoned or destroyed to speed the retreat. "They're in the kill zone," called Colonel Wang. "All units, fire." The ridge erupted in fire and thunder. 3 Chinese divisions plus our Marauder regiment opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of lead that swept through the Japanese column like a scythe. The distinctive crack of American M1 Garands mixed with the deeper boom of Chinese rifles and the chatter of machine guns from both armies. The effect was devastating. The head of the Japanese column simply disappeared in the hail of bullets. Soldiers fell by the dozens, their bodies tumbling into the muddy trail. Pack animals screamed and bolted, scattering equipment across the jungle floor. The organized retreat instantly became a scene of chaos and terror. I fired as fast as I could work the bolt of my Garand, the rifle kicking against my shoulder with each shot. Below us, Japanese soldiers were scrambling for cover, but there was precious little to be found on the open trail. Some tried to return fire, but shooting uphill in the darkness against prepared positions was nearly impossible. "They're trying to flank us on the left," shouted Murphy, pointing toward a group of Japanese soldiers who were attempting to work their way up the ridge through the thick jungle. Colonel Wang was already responding, directing a company of Chinese troops to meet the threat. 2nd Battalion left flank. Do not let them reach the ridge. The battle expanded as Japanese forces desperately tried to break through our lines. What had started as an ambush was becoming a full-scale engagement, with both sides pouring in reinforcements. From the north, we could hear the sound of British artillery beginning to fall on the rear of the Japanese column. The trap was complete. Private Chen beside me was firing with mechanical precision, working the bolt of his rifle with practiced ease. Each shot found its mark in the mass of Japanese troops below. When he paused to reload, I could see tears streaming down his face. "For my family," he said quietly in Chinese, inserting a fresh clip. "For all the families they murdered." The fighting continued through the night. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers threw themselves at our positions, each assault more desperate than the last. They knew this was their only chance to escape the encirclement, and they fought with the fury of trapped animals. Around midnight, the character of the battle changed. Instead of trying to break through, the Japanese began what could only be described as human wave attacks, massed charges against our strongest positions. It was suicide, but it was also the Japanese military tradition of death before surrender. Banzai! Banzai! The cries echoed across the valley as hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged up the slopes of our ridge. They came with bayonets fixed, officers leading with drawn swords, faces twisted with desperate courage. Our machine guns cut them down in rows, but still they came. I had never seen anything like it, men running straight into certain death rather than accept defeat. "It was terrifying and heartbreaking at the same time," whispered Murphy, momentarily stopping his firing to stare at the carnage below. "They're committing suicide." Lieutenant Morrison crawled over to our position, his uniform torn and his face blackened with gunpowder. "Ammunition report," he called. "Running low on rifle ammo," I replied. "Maybe 2 clips left." "Same here," said Murphy. All along the line, American and China soldiers were reporting similar shortages. We'd been firing almost continuously for 6 hours, and our supplies were running out. But the Japanese attacks were also weakening. Each charge left fewer survivors to mount the next assault. As dawn broke over the jungle, the full extent of the carnage became visible. The trail below our position was carpeted with Japanese bodies, hundreds of them, lying in neat rows where our machine guns had cut them down. Scattered among the dead were abandoned weapons equipment and personal belongings. Entire Japanese armies' worth of material was spread across the valley floor. "My God," said Colonel Wang, surveying the battlefield through binoculars. "I count at least 2,000 dead in our sector alone." Lieutenant Morrison was on the radio, coordinating with other Allied units. "British forces report similar casualties in their sector," he announced, "and the Chinese 38th Division has taken nearly 3,000 prisoners." The numbers were almost incomprehensible. In one night of fighting, we had effectively destroyed the Japanese 28th Army as a fighting force. General Sakurai's breakout attempt had failed completely, with casualties so severe that the unit would never recover. But the cost to our side had been significant as well. Private Chen lay motionless in his foxhole, killed by a Japanese grenade during the final banzai charge. His young face was peaceful now, finally at rest after 8 years of war. Multiply his story by thousands, and you began to understand the true price of victory in the Pacific Theater. Sergeant Chen, "We're moving out in 30 minutes, called Lieutenant Morrison. The British report that Japanese resistance has collapsed across the entire front. General Sakurai is reportedly dead, and the remnants of his army are surrendering in large numbers." I looked down at the valley one more time. Nearly 100,000 Japanese troops had entered Burma with dreams of conquest. Now, perhaps 10,000 survivors were trudging toward prisoner of war camps, their army annihilated, and their dreams of empire shattered forever. 2 weeks later, I found myself in Rangoon, the Burmese capital that had been liberated by British forces as the Japanese collapse accelerated. The monsoon rains had finally stopped, and for the first time in months, I could see clear blue sky through the jungle canopy. Merrill's Marauders were being disbanded, our mission complete, our objective achieved beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The final tally was staggering. Of the nearly 100,000 Japanese troops trapped in central Burma, fewer than 15,000 had survived to reach prisoner of war camps. The rest had been killed in action, died of disease and starvation during the retreat, or committed suicide rather than surrender. It was the most complete military disaster in Japanese history, surpassing even the destruction of their navy at Midway. I was sitting in a Red Cross station, writing a letter to my parents in San Francisco, when Lieutenant Morrison approached with a newspaper in his hand. The headline read, "Burma Army annihilated 85,000 Japanese casualties in Allied victory. Makes it real, doesn't it?" Morrison said, settling into a chair beside me. Seeing it in print like that, I nodded, thinking about all the faces I'd seen during those terrible weeks in the jungle. Japanese faces, Chinese faces, American faces, all young men caught up in a war that had consumed an entire generation. 85,000 casualties, I repeated. That's more than live in my entire hometown. Morrison was quiet for a moment, staring at the newspaper. "The war's almost over, you know. Intelligence reports that Japan is on the verge of surrender. Their position is hopeless, no navy, no air force, and now no army in Southeast Asia." He was right. Unknown to us at the time, Emperor Hirohito was already preparing to announce Japan's surrender. The atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan. The destruction of the Burma Area Army was just the final nail in the coffin of Japanese militarism. "What are you going to do when you get home?" Morrison asked. I thought about that question for a long time. What do you do after participating in the complete annihilation of an enemy army? How do you return to civilian life after witnessing destruction on such a massive scale? "Help my father with his restaurant, I guess," I finally answered. "Try to forget what we saw here." Morrison shook his head. "I don't think we should forget. I think we should remember every face, every name, every moment. Because if we forget, we might have to do it all over again." He was right about that, too. The price of victory in Burma had been paid in blood, not just Japanese blood, but Chinese blood, British blood, American blood. Private Chen and thousands like him had died to stop an empire built on conquest and brutality. Their sacrifice had meaning only if the world learned from it. As I finished my letter home, I tried to find words to explain what we had accomplished. How do you tell your parents that you participated in the largest military disaster in your enemy's history? How do you describe the systematic destruction of an entire army? In the end, I kept it simple. The Japanese army in Burma has been defeated. The war here is over. I'll be coming home soon. But I knew that in some ways, I would never really come home. Part of me would always remain in that jungle, listening to the rain on the leaves and the sound of artillery in the distance. Part of me would always be that 24-year-old sergeant, watching an empire die in the mud of central Burma. The Burma campaign officially ended on August 15, 1945, the same day Japan announced its surrender. General Sakurai was indeed dead, killed during the final evacuation attempt. His 28th Army had ceased to exist as a military unit. Of the nearly 100,000 Japanese troops who had defended Burma, fewer than 10,000 would ever see Japan again. For the Allies, victory in Burma opened the door to the planned invasion of Japan itself. Chinese forces could now be redeployed from Burma to prepare for operations against the Japanese home islands. British forces were freed up for the reconquest of Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. American units like Merrill's Marauders had proven that Western troops could not only survive in jungle conditions, but could decisively defeat Japanese forces on their own terms. But perhaps more importantly, the destruction of the Japanese Burma Area Army marked the end of Japan's dream of Asian conquest. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, built on the promise of liberating Asia from Western colonialism, had revealed itself to be nothing more than brutal occupation. The peoples of Southeast Asia had seen both Japanese occupation and Allied liberation, and they knew which they preferred. As I packed my kit for the journey home, I thought about Private Chen and the millions of Chinese who had died fighting Japanese aggression. Their war had lasted 8 long years, from the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 to the surrender in Tokyo Bay in 1945. They had paid the highest price for victory, and their sacrifice had made possible the destruction of Japanese militarism in Southeast Asia. The last entry in my journal, written on the troopship taking us home to San Francisco, read simply, "Burma campaign concluded. Mission accomplished. Price paid in full." 60 years later, as an old man telling this story to my grandchildren, I can still see those faces in the jungle. I can still hear the sound of rain on the leaves and the distant rumble of artillery. I remember the weight of my rifle, the smell of gunpowder, and the moment when nearly 100,000 enemy soldiers realized they had nowhere to run, and we had every direction covered. That was victory in the Pacific Theater, complete, decisive, and purchased with the blood of heroes from 3 nations. It was the end of an empire and the birth of a new world order. And I was privileged to witness it, survive it, and live to tell the tale.